The 21st of August, 2022, Oakland, California, 60. Year, old Chinese-American dentist Lily Xu and her boyfriend of more than a decade were getting ready to go to a massage parlor, just like any other day. The car had just pulled over. Lily Xu stepped out of the passenger side. The next second, a man suddenly rushed out of a nearby white car. No warning, no negotiation. Within seconds, 3 gunshots rang out in quick succession. Lily Xu collapsed on the street, but her boyfriend, who was with her, managed to take cover back inside the car. At first, everyone thought this was a failed street robbery. Lily Xu hadn't handed over any valuables, so she was shot. On top of that, Oakland's Little Saigon neighborhood had been experiencing a severe spike in crime, with Asian residents being attacked with increasing frequency. Many people even believed this was a hate crime targeting Asians. Lily Xu's boyfriend, Nelson, also broke down in tears in front of the media. He said he watched his loved one fall right in front of him. He said he would never forget those few seconds. He attended vigils. He gave interviews. He even organized a memorial concert for Lily Xuan, the surface. He seemed just like everyone else, another victim of this tragedy. But 2 months later, the case took an unbelievable turn. Police first arrested the man who fired the shots. Then they put handcuffs on the person closest to Lily Xu. That person was none other than the boyfriend who had been standing beside her at the scene, the one who had wept almost beyond words afterward. Nelson Paulus believed this was not a random robbery, nor was it a hate crime. It was a premeditated murder for hire, and more chillingly, the gunman may have been merely the executor of a larger plan. The person who truly knew where Lily Xu would be that day, what time she would arrive, and where she would park, had been right beside her all along. So why would Nelson want to kill the woman he had been with for more than a decade? Why did that white car show up at the scene so early? And why did the gunman ignore Nelson, who was closer, and charge straight at Lily Xu instead? All the answers start with those 3 gunshots on the streets of Oakland on the 21st of August, 2022. The 21st of August, 2022, Oakland, California. It was an ordinary Sunday afternoon. 60-year-old Chinese-American dentist Lily Xu and her longtime boyfriend Nelson were heading to a massage parlor near the Little Saigon neighborhood. For both of them, it was just another routine outing. Nelson drove to the area near the massage parlor and parked across the street. Once the car was stopped, Lily Xu got out from the passenger side. Before stepping out, she reminded Nelson to help put a few bags and clothes from the car into the trunk. No one realized that while they were parking, an old white car had already been lingering in the vicinity for quite some time. That car hadn't just happened to pass by. Later police review of nearby surveillance footage revealed that it had been circling the area repeatedly. It seemed to be looking for something, or waiting for something. When Lily Xu's car finally came to a stop, the man in the white car made his move. The door swung open. A man got out quickly. His movements showed no hesitation. What was even stranger was that Nelson was actually closer to him. But the gunman didn't go after Nelson. He didn't even try to restrain him. Instead, he bypassed the car entirely and zeroed in on Lily Xu, who had just stepped out of the passenger side. Everything happened too fast. Lily Xu didn't even have time to process what was occurring. Surveillance footage from the area captured her terrified screams. Then 3 gunshots rang out. From the moment the gunman rushed toward Lily Xu to the moment he finished the attack and prepared to flee, the entire sequence lasted only seconds. Nelson, meanwhile, scrambled back into the car and avoided the gunfire. When the shot stopped, Lily Xu was already on the ground. The gunman didn't pursue Nelson. He didn't stay to rummage through her belongings. He quickly returned to the white car and sped away. Neighbors who heard the shots rushed outside. Some called 911. Others grabbed towels, hoping to help stop the bleeding. Nelson also made his way to Lily Xu's side. By then, she was severely wounded and unconscious. Paramedics arrived and rushed Lily Xu to the hospital. But her injuries were too severe. She was pronounced dead that evening. Just a few weeks earlier, Lily Xu had celebrated her 60th birthday. At the party, she sat with family and friends. She even performed a ballet routine. At that moment, her career was stable, her life comfortable, and she had a partner who had been by her side for more than a decade. No one could have imagined that just 2 weeks later, she would be gunned down on an Oakland street. When police arrived at the scene, their first thought was robbery. That assumption wasn't surprising, because at the time, Oakland, especially the Little Saigon neighborhood, was in the grip of a serious crime wave. Just over a month before Lily Shu's murder, a similar shooting had occurred nearby. A Chinese-American rideshare driver was attacked inside his car and later died, so when police saw an Asian woman shot on the street, their immediate reaction was natural: another random street robbery, or perhaps a violent crime targeting Asians. But as investigators began examining the scene, an unusual detail emerged. Lily Shu's belongings hadn't actually been stolen. If the gunman's goal was robbery, why did he spend almost no time demanding valuables? Why was there no prolonged threat or negotiation? And more importantly, why did he pass up Nelson, who was closer, and go straight for Lily Shu? 3 bullets, one clear target, the attack over in seconds, then immediate escape. Was this really just a failed street robbery? At the time, no one knew the answer, including the police. Most people still viewed the case through the lens of Oakland's deteriorating public safety. But later, a piece of surveillance footage would completely change everyone's understanding, because that white car wasn't just passing by. Before the shooting, it appeared to have been waiting for her. After Lily Shu's death, the case quickly sent shockwaves through Oakland's Chinese and Asian American communities, for a very simple reason. Given the social context at the time, the shooting seemed to fit everyone's idea of random street violence to a T. The crime scene was near the Little Saigon neighborhood. For years, this area had been home to a large concentration of Vietnamese, Chinese, and other Asian residents and business owners. Over the preceding years, as local juan deteriorated, robberies, burglaries, and shootings had increased noticeably. Many store owners had already gotten into the habit of closing early. Some shops that used to stay open until 5 p.m. were shuttering by 6 or Wu in the afternoon. People installed iron bars on windows. Some boarded up their glass storefronts. Some owners were so afraid of nighttime break-ins that they slept in their stores. Fear of violent crime had been building for a long time. And just over a month before Lily Shu was killed, another shocking shooting had occurred nearby. A Wushar Jianyir, an old Chinese-American rideshare driver, was forcibly pulled from his car by 2 men while waiting for a fare. When he refused to cooperate, gunshots rang out. That attack was also extremely brief. The victim died at the scene. His phone and wallet didn't end up being the main focus of the crime. That case made local Asian residents even more anxious. Many began to suspect that criminals were deliberately targeting Asians. So when Lily Shu was shot on a Sunday afternoon, the community almost immediately connected the 2 incidents. Close in time, close in location. Both victims were Asian, and both attacks were executed with shocking speed. Under those circumstances, anti-Jan Asian hate violences quickly became a major topic of public discussion. Moreover, anti-Jan Asian hate incidents were drawing widespread attention across the country at the time. For local residents, Lily Shu's death didn't look like an isolated event. It felt like yet another eruption of the long-running Juan crisis and violence against Asians. Lily Shu's family and friends thought so too. They couldn't accept that a doctor who had lived in the community for years and helped countless patients could be suddenly killed in broad daylight, especially when they learned that her belongings hadn't been obviously taken. Suspicions grew even stronger. If it was just robbery, why didn't the gunman take anything? Could it be that the real motive wasn't money at all? Was Lily Shu targeted from the start because she was Asian? The day after the murder, more and more community members began gathering. Some lit candles, some laid flowers, others went directly to City Hall, demanding answers from local government and police. They were angry, not just about Lily Shu's death, but about years of accumulated frustration. Stores burglarized, cars stolen, street shootings, calls to police that went unanswered for too long. Many felt they were living in danger every day without seeing any real change. Lily Shu's case became the spark. All the pent-up anger finally ignited. Some publicly questioned the police. How many more incidents like this would it take before the government took real action? Police subsequently announced they would increase patrols in Little Saigon and urged nearby businesses to check their surveillance footage. The Chinese consulate in San Francisco also issued a safety advisory. In terms of public narrative, the case was almost immediately labeled another violent tragedy in the Asian community, and standing before everyone was Nelson, who also looked like another victim of the tragedy. He had watched his girlfriend fall right in front of him. He was right there when the gunman attacked. If he hadn't managed to duck back into the car, he might have been a target too. At least that is what almost everyone believed in the first few days. Nelson repeatedly emphasized the chaos of the scene in his media interviews. The screaming, the gunshots, the car door slamming, the engine revving. It all happened too fast. He said he couldn't even fully recall what he had done in that moment. By the time he truly processed what had happened, Lily Shu was already on the ground. Whenever he got to that part, he would become emotionally overwhelmed, sometimes covering his face with his hands, sometimes crying so hard he couldn't finish a sentence. Journalists and friends could only offer comfort. That behavior reinforced the public's perception. A man who had just lost his partner of more than a decade right before his eyes. Of course he would break down. Of course he would be in pain. Of course he wanted the police to catch the killer quickly. So in the early stages of the investigation, almost all attention was focused on the white car and the unknown gunman. Police began searching for the vehicle. Community members provided surveillance footage. Residents recalled any suspicious people they had seen around the time of the shooting. The investigative direction was very clear. Find the robber who appeared out of nowhere. But as more surveillance footage was collected, one question became increasingly glaring. If this was really a random robbery, then the gunman's behavior was completely inconsistent with typical robbery logic. He hadn't scouted for a target on the fly. The white car had been in the area well before. He hadn't gone after the closest person. He bypassed Nelson and went straight for Lily Shu. Nor did he waste time at the scene rummaging through valuables. The moment the shots were fired, he left immediately. The whole thing looked more like a mission, not a spur-Jan of Jan the Jan moment robbery. What is more, someone later noticed that the white car had been parked in the vicinity for a considerable time before Lily Shu even appeared. That pointed to a far more sinister possibility. The gunman hadn't spotted her by chance. He may have known in advance that Lily Shu would be at that place, at that exact time. If that theory held, the very nature of the case would be completely upended, because the real question would no longer be who pulled the trigger. It would be another, far more critical one. Who told the gunman Lily Shu's schedule? After the murder, Nelson quickly became the focus of media attention. After all, he was one of the closest people in Lily Shu's life. They had lived together for more than a decade. Though not formally married, they had been partners for years. To outsiders, they had stable finances and a shared social circle. On Lily Shu's Liu Shiti's birthday, Nelson had celebrated with friends. The party wasn't extravagant, but it was warm and lively. Lily Shu even performed a ballet piece for everyone. No one could have guessed that just days later, Nelson would sit before journalists, describing how he watched her fall on the street. During interviews, his emotions appeared almost completely unhinged. He said everything happened too suddenly. The screams, the gunshots, the sound of car doors banging, the engine starting, all the sounds blended together. He couldn't even accurately recall what he had done in those moments. He said that when he finally came to his senses, Lily Shu was already on the ground. Unresponsive, he rushed over and held her, one hand supporting her head, the other trying to apply pressure to the wound. Neighbors who heard the shots also came running. Some brought towels, some called emergency services. Some stood by the road waiting for police and ambulances. As Nelson recounted these details, he repeatedly covered his face. Sometimes he cried so hard he had to pause for a long time before continuing. To many journalists and friends, this was simply a man who had just lost his partner. He looked not only grief-stricken, but also deeply traumatized. Lily Shu's friends also had little reason to suspect him. After all, they had lived together for years, and Nelson was right there at the scene. If the gunman had lingered a few more seconds, he might have been a victim too. So in the early days of the case, few people paid much attention to Nelson. The real focus was, who was the gunman in the white car? Why did he target Lily Shu? Was this another anti-Asian hate crime? Nelson also kept himself in the public eye along those lines. On August Arshar, Liaochenin Arshar, the day after Lily Shu's murder, family, friends, and community members held a vigil near the crime scene. People lit candles, placed flowers, mourned the Chinese-American dentist who had practiced in the community for years. Nelson had originally agreed to attend. It was said he even planned to speak, urging police to solve the case quickly. But when the day came, he didn't show up in person. In the end, he sent a friend to represent him. At the time, that detail didn't raise much suspicion. Many assumed he was simply too emotional to face a large crowd. On September E, Lily Shu's funeral and memorial service took place. Hundreds came to pay their respects. The church was nearly full. Nelson and his son both spoke. At the emotional peak, he even sang a song in memory of Lily Shu. To those in attendance, it was a long and painful farewell. But as the investigation deepened, police began re-examining every move Nelson made after the murder. One of the first details to raise questions was what happened after Lily Shu was taken to the hospital. According to the original account, Nelson did not immediately follow the ambulance to the hospital. Instead, he chose to stay at the scene to complete police interviews and procedures, and only went later. On its own, that behavior doesn't prove anything. Witnesses at crime scenes often need to be questioned by police, and people under extreme shock don't always behave as others might expect. But when police later learned more, that detail began to look different. There was also the reward. Lily Shu was well off. Nelson himself had lived comfortably for years, yet in the search for the gunman, he did not actively offer a substantial reward to help move the investigation forward. Again, that alone isn't evidence of a crime. No law requires a victim's family to post a reward. However, when these disparate behaviors were viewed together, investigators began noticing a pattern. Nelson displayed tremendous grief, but when it came to actions that might actually push the investigation forward, he didn't seem to show the same level of urgency. Even more troubling, as police expanded their probe, a person familiar with Lily Shu and local businesses began repeatedly reviewing the surveillance footage. This person had long-term experience with security camera systems. Because of the deteriorating Jiuan in Little Saigon, he had installed cameras for many nearby shops and residences. With the owner's permission, he pulled up footage from multiple angles around the time of the shooting. At first, like most people, he assumed it was a robbery, but the more he watched, the more something felt off. The gunman's actions were too deliberate, the white car's presence was too purposeful. Most importantly, that car seemed to have been waiting, and when he learned more about the day's schedule, he discovered something crucial. Lily Shu's trip to the massage parlor wasn't a last-minute decision. The appointment had been made the day before, and the person who made the call to book it was Nelson. That meant that before the shooting, the number of people who could accurately know where Lily Shu would be at what time the next day was very small. Nelson was the one who knew best. Of course, that alone still didn't prove he was involved in the crime. It is perfectly normal for a partner to book a massage appointment. But if the gunman was indeed lying in wait, then the picture changed completely, because it meant the attacker may have been given the itinerary in advance. And as police continued analyzing the footage, another puzzling detail emerged. When the gunman got out of the car, he could have gone after Nelson first. Nelson wasn't far away, but the gunman essentially ignored him. His target was always Lily Shu. At that moment, a different possibility emerged. Maybe Nelson wasn't just a lucky survivor. Maybe from the very beginning, the gunman knew exactly who not to touch. What truly started to steer the case away from the random robbery narrative wasn't a new witness, nor any sudden discovery of decisive physical evidence at the scene. It was a piece of surveillance footage that was watched over and over. After the murder, police gradually collected video from nearby businesses and residences. Because the immediate area around the crime scene had limited camera coverage, the initial footage was incomplete. All they could confirm was that an old white car had been in the vicinity. Then, someone familiar with the local security systems noticed an anomaly while reviewing the recordings. The white car hadn't appeared only after Lily Shu parked. Before the shooting, it had already been parked about half a block from the scene, and it had stayed there for a considerable time, about 10 分钟 Utes. 10分钟 Utes isn't exceptionally long, but in the context of a supposed random robbery, it was very strange. Why would a robber looking for a spontaneous target sit in the same spot for so long? Even more critically, during that wait, a police cruiser had actually passed nearby. Under normal circumstances, if someone in the car was planning a random attack, the safest move upon seeing a police car would be to leave immediately. But the white car didn't leave. It stayed put. That behavior didn't look like someone looking for an opportunity. It looked more like someone waiting for a specific person. The surveillance analyst continued watching. When Lily Shu's and Nelson's car finally arrived, only then did the white car show clear movement. In other words, the suspect hadn't randomly picked a car that happened to stop. They appeared to have anticipated the target's arrival. That finding made investigators re-examine the entire sequence. If the killer knew Lily Shu was coming, then the question shifted from who happened to choose her to who knew her schedule that day, who knew she would be there at that time, who knew she was going to that particular massage parlor. The answer wasn't hard to find. Lily Shu's massage appointment that day wasn't made on a whim. According to the original case information, the appointment had been booked the day before by Nelson. That meant Nelson had the most accurate time and location information. Of course, it is normal for partners to make appointments for each other. On its own, that wasn't even a red flag. But when combined with the surveillance footage showing the car waiting in advance, the meaning changed entirely, because someone had to provide the exact itinerary to the gunman. Otherwise, the white car couldn't have been there with such precision. Police then turned their attention back to the attack itself. After the gunman got out, Nelson was actually closer to him. But the gunman didn't hesitate. He didn't try to secure the scene first. He went straight around to the other side, heading for Lily Shu. That choice of trajectory was very telling in a robbery. The closer and more vulnerable target usually gets hit first. But this gunman acted as if he didn't care that someone else was nearby. He only needed to accomplish one thing: find Lily Shu and shoot. That behavior was increasingly inconsistent with a random crime. There was also another issue from start to finish. The attack was extremely short. The gunman barely interacted with Lily Shu at all. No prolonged threats. No repeated demands for valuables. No patting down the victim. He just moved in fast, fired, and left. It looked far more like a targeted hit than a spontaneous robbery gone wrong. One particularly unsettling detail from the footage was that the white car appeared to have been circling the area beforehand. That meant the people in the car may not only have arrived early, they may have been scouting the surroundings, checking the roads, confirming the parking position, even making sure police weren't nearby. If that was the case, then the level of preparation for this crime was far higher than anyone initially imagined. Police began to suspect the attack may never have been about taking anything from Lily Shu at all. The robbery was just the easiest surface narrative. In a city like Oakland, where violent crime was already rampant, a street shooting alone was enough to create misdirection. As long as the gunman appeared fast and left fast, leaving a scene that looked chaotic, most people's first reaction would be random crime. That also explained why the public narrative quickly turned to Jiran and anti-Jan Asian hate. The environment itself provided the perfect cover for the real planner, but the surveillance footage tore a hole in that cover, because random crime could explain the gunshots. It could explain the escape. It could even explain why the victim's belongings weren't taken. But it couldn't easily explain the pre-fay waiting, and it certainly couldn't explain the pinpoint targeting. Investigators realized they may have been asking the wrong questions. They had been asking who was the gunman in the white car. Now the real question was, how did he know Lily Shu was coming? And to answer that, they had to find the white car. If they could trace the vehicle, they might find the driver. Once they found the person in the car, they might learn whether someone else was behind the street fay-level killing. Soon, police used the surveillance vehicle information to trace the white car. The investigation showed the car came from a dealership about 10 kilometers from the crime scene, not long before the murder. It had been purchased by a Senshisen Fayer failed man. His name, Hashim. And when police entered that name into the system, they discovered he wasn't a stranger to law enforcement records. More importantly, his fingerprints and DNA were already in the police database. As the case shifted direction, police focused their investigation on the white car. Surveillance had already proven that the vehicle hadn't just happened to pass the scene. It had arrived early, waited nearby, and moved into action right after Lily Shu arrived. If they could find that car, they might find the shooter directly. Police began frame-by-frame analysis of the footage. Although the on-site camera coverage was limited, as nearby businesses submitted more video, the car's characteristics became clearer. Investigators eventually obtained enough information to trace the vehicle. It turned out the car had originally belonged to a dealership near Stockton, about 100 kilometers from the Little Saigon neighborhood where Lily Hsu was killed. Not long before the murder, the car had been sold. The buyer was a 33-year-old man, Hashim Paulus. Quickly began looking into the name. On the surface, he had no obvious connection to Lily Hsu. Lily Hsu was a 60-year-old Chinese-American dentist. Hashim had once played tennis. They were different ages, different social circles, different careers. If this was a targeted murder, police first needed to figure out why would a man with no apparent connection to Lily Hsu be at the shooting scene. Investigators continued digging into Hashim's background. Soon, they found an unexpected lead. Hashim had been a professional tennis player. In his earlier years, he had even competed in formal matches. If the investigation had stopped there, he might have just been a suspect who appeared out of nowhere. But Hashim had another past. About 10 years earlier, he had been involved in a protest that led to a confrontation with police. At the time, a parcel of land in California used for agricultural and botanical research was facing commercial development. Opponents organized protests to stop the land from being turned into parking lots, shops, and other commercial facilities. Hashim was among the participants. During the protest, police intervened. There was a standoff. Hashim was arrested in connection with that incident, and because of that case, his identification had entered the police system, including his fingerprints and his DNA record. The files from 10 years ago suddenly became crucial. After Lily Hsu's murder, police had collected multiple pieces of physical evidence at the scene, including traces related to the shooting and fingerprints found near Lily Hsu's car. Investigators began comparing those with Hashim's database records. The results showed a match. That meant police were no longer suspicious of Hashim just because of the white car. They now had physical evidence directly linking him to the scene. The investigation was quickly upgraded. Police obtained a search warrant for Hashim's residence. There, they found multiple guns. Those weapons were then sent for further testing. One of them, after ballistic analysis, was determined to be connected to Lily Hsu's shooting. At that point, police seemed to have found the man in the white car. The vehicle pointed to him. The scene evidence pointed to him. The weapon connected him to the shooting. On the 27th of October 2022, about 2 months after Lily Hsu's murder, Hashim was arrested. For the community waiting for answers, this should have been a major breakthrough. A gunman who had been on the run for 2 months had finally been caught. The case finally seemed to have a conclusion. Maybe he was the violent criminal who roamed Oakland looking for targets. Maybe Lily Hsu had simply been his unfortunate victim. But police didn't immediately close the case, because one critical question still had no answer. Why did Hashim kill Lily Hsu? Investigators found no personal grudge between the two. No debt disputes, no work conflicts, no evidence they had ever directly interacted. If it was robbery, the behavior at the scene didn't fit. He didn't take Lily Hsu's belongings. He didn't linger to search for valuables. He just fired and fled. That meant while police had found the shooter, they may not have found the real reason. And as they investigated, Hashim's social connections, an even more surprising piece of information emerged. He wasn't completely disconnected from Lily Hsu's life. He knew someone extremely close to her, Nelson. More precisely, they didn't just know each other. They had had contact for years. Hashim had once been Nelson's tennis coach. Their relationship went back many years. According to people who knew both, Nelson liked to play tennis, and they had met in tennis circles about a decade earlier. Since then, they had stayed in touch. That discovery immediately changed how police understood the case. Previously, investigators were looking at 2 separate threads. On one side, Lily Hsu's boyfriend of over a decade. On the other side, the man driving the white car, suspected of the shooting. Now those 2 threads suddenly connected. Paulus began rethinking the entire sequence on the day of the murder. Nelson knew when Lily Hsu was going to the massage parlor. He had personally made the booking. Hashim had driven the white car to the area early. He waited, confirmed the target, attacked, And throughout the entire process, the gunman never treated Nelson as a target. Was that really just a coincidence? Police decided to check Hashim's phone. They wanted to know who this man had contacted before the crime, why he was there, and who had told him that Lily Shu would be at that massage parlor at that time. Soon, investigators found the answer they were looking for in the phone, and the name that appeared once again pointed to Nelson. At that moment, the case finally moved from who pulled the trigger to an even more chilling question. If Hashim was only the one who pulled the trigger, then who was truly behind it all? After Hashim's arrest, police quickly realized that the truly complicated part of this case was just beginning. Because finding the shooter didn't mean finding the whole truth. Hashim and Lily Shu had no obvious personal relationship, no long Faderm connection, no public feud, no direct dispute that could explain a murder motive. So why would a complete stranger drive to the massage parlor in advance? Why was he willing to wait there? And why, after the target appeared, did he strike without hesitation? Police suspected there was someone else behind it. So they started going through Hashim's phone, call logs, text messages, chat apps, contacts, communication timestamps before and after the murder. Every piece of data that could reconstruct his movements was re-examined. Soon, a name caught investigators' attention. Nelson, the man who had accompanied Lily Shu to the massage parlor that day. The man who was present during the shooting but wasn't attacked. The man who had repeatedly wept in front of the media as the grieving longtime boyfriend. The investigation showed that Hashim and Nelson hadn't just met before the murder. Their relationship went back years. Nelson liked playing tennis. Hashim had a professional tennis background and had even served as Nelson's coach. Mutual acquaintances recalled that they had known each other for a long time. That connection alone didn't prove a crime. But when police placed it back into the timeline, everything began to take on a different meaning. Lily Shu's trip to the massage parlor that day was known to Nelson in advance. The appointment had been made with his involvement. The gunman, Hashim, had driven to the area early to wait. At the time of the attack, he didn't go after Nelson. Instead, he locked on to Lily Shu, and now police discovered that the two men already knew each other. Investigators dug deeper into the phone content. According to the original case materials, police found communications in Hashim's records that were suspected of discussing the attack with Nelson. It wasn't just ordinary contact. The messages were believed to cover multiple key elements of the plot: timing, location, operational details. Police believe this meant the shooting wasn't a spontaneous idea that formed on the day. The planning may have begun as early as July 2024. That meant, while Lily Shu went about her life unaware, there were already discussions about where she would be and how to target her. Even more alarming to investigators was that the communications also touched on how to handle the aftermath. According to the original information, Hashim even allegedly gave Nelson advice, if police later asked him, as an eyewitness, to identify suspects, he should steer the investigation in the wrong direction. If that content was confirmed, then the entire plan wasn't just about killing. It also included using Nelson's status as a surviving witness to create cover for the real shooter. That also suddenly explained a puzzling detail from the day. Why didn't the gunman attack Nelson? Because according to police suspicion, he was never on the target list from the start. Nelson's role may have been to stay alive. He needed to live. He needed to be a witness. He needed to tell police how sudden everything was, and possibly to provide a seemingly plausible but false direction in the subsequent investigation. That way, all the surface appearances could be reinterpreted. A gunman attacks in a high fake crime neighborhood. The scene looks like a robbery. The victim is Asian. The boyfriend survives. The actual perpetrator escapes quickly. Then the public's attention naturally shifts to random violence and anti-Asian hate, and the person most likely to know the truth can stand before the media, giving interviews as a grieving family member. If that was the plan, its true genius wasn't in how the gunman fired. It was in how the planner tried to use the city's social climate at the time to create the most believable answer. Oakland has bad GRN. Asians are frequently attacked. Lily Shu was just another unlucky victim. As long as everyone accepted that story, the person behind the scenes had a chance to disappear from the investigation entirely. But the phone records destroyed that. Because digital communications don't vanish, just because someone cries on camera. Police followed the connection between the two men. Soon, they began confronting a new question. Why would Hashim agree to do this? According to the investigative direction in the original materials, the answer was likely money. Police believed he may have been paid a sum to participate in the attack. If Hashim was the executor, then the person providing the payment was likely the true beneficiary of the whole plan. So the focus shifted back to Nelson. Police began examining his finances, his relationship with Lily Shu, their asset arrangements during their years together, and whether there had been any changes between them before Lily Shu's murder. As a result, investigators discovered that Lily Shu's wealth was far greater than most people imagined. According to case documents, her total assets were estimated to be worth between 1,200,000 Lian and 1,400,000 Lian. That included real estate, financial accounts, trusts, and insurance fair-related assets. And Nelson, coincidentally, had a background in finance. That meant he was more familiar than the average person with how these assets should be managed, and more aware of how wealth might be redistributed after someone's death. Police later discovered that before Lily Shu's murder, there appeared to have been some unusual moves involving these assets. A possible motive finally began to surface. This case moved from, did the boyfriend participate in planning, to an even more fundamental question. What exactly could Nelson gain from the death of the woman he had lived with for over a decade? To understand why police eventually focused their investigation on Nelson, it is necessary to first go back to Lily Shu's life. Because what is truly shocking about this case isn't just that she died on the street. It is that police later suspected the person who wanted her gone may have been the man who had been by her side for more than 10 years. Lily Shu was born in 1962. In her youth, she received dental education in Shanghai, and after graduation, joined the 9th People's Hospital affiliated with Shanghai Jiao Tong University School of Medicine. To many, that was already a stable and respectable career path. Professional, respectable, clear prospects. But around 1995, because her husband had an opportunity to go to the United States, Lily Shu chose to leave China with her family. After arriving in the US, she quickly realized that her previous professional background in China wouldn't allow her to practice dentistry right away. To become a dentist again, she had to start over almost from scratch. First, language. To adapt to the new environment, she spent a lot of time learning English, taking care of the family during the day, studying at night after the children went to sleep. Then professional credentials. She re-entered the American dental education system, completing courses and training to obtain local licensure as soon as possible. For someone who already had a mature career, that process wasn't easy. She wasn't a fresh graduate. She was an adult who had to prove herself all over again. But eventually, she succeeded. After obtaining her license, Lily Shu didn't choose to work long term in a large medical institution. She set her sights on Oakland, especially the local Little Saigon neighborhood. It was home to a large Asian population. Besides Vietnamese, there were many Chinese and other immigrant families. Shared cultural background and language helped her quickly spot an opportunity. Lily Shu decided to open her own dental practice. At first, her then-Fei husband didn't fully support the decision compared to running her own clinic. He preferred a more stable career path, but Lily Shu stuck to her choice, and it turned out she was exceptionally good at it. She had solid skills, a direct personality. She connected with patients without much distance. Plus, her fees were reasonable, so the clinic quickly built a strong reputation. More and more local residents became regular patients. Some families had multiple generations treated by her. Over time, Lily Shu's role in the community gradually evolved. She was no longer just a dentist. She was someone who had put down roots there for years, trusted and familiar to many. Patients with financial difficulties received extra care from her. Those who couldn't afford full treatment got more affordable options. Sometimes, when faced with elderly people, religious figures, or struggling families, she would even waive fees. These actions earned her a high standing in the community, but at the same time, her first marriage began to fray. Her career grew busier. The couple's life plans started to diverge. Eventually, they parted ways. After that, Lily Shu continued raising her children and poured more energy into her career. After years of hard work, her financial situation improved significantly. The practice was stable. Income was solid. She later opened additional locations. She owned property and began exploring investments and wealth management. It was around this time that Nelson entered her life. Their meeting wasn't like a sudden romantic story. By then, Lily Shu had accumulated significant wealth and was thinking about how to manage her assets, but she wasn't very familiar with complex financial investments. An acquaintance introduced her to a man with a financial background. That man was Nelson. According to the original account, Nelson was more than 10 years older than Lily Shuhei, had run financial businesses and owned his own investment company. He spoke gently, lived a refined lifestyle, liked music, and enjoyed tennis on paper. He seemed like a good match for Lily Shu. Both had been married before. Both already had family histories. Neither was at a stage in life where they would build a relationship solely on passion. So when they started seeing each other, things developed naturally. There was no grand public wedding, no deliberate romantic narrative. They simply came together and began living as a couple. That arrangement lasted over a decade. For Lily Shu, Nelson was clearly more than just a boyfriend. He had become deeply embedded in her life. Her daily routines, her social circles, her finances, her hobbies, even her later lifestyle was influenced by him. After meeting Nelson, Lily Shu took up piano, learned ballet, explored interests she had never seriously pursued before. To many friends and family, the relationship seemed to enrich her life. Career stable, financially comfortable, children grown, a long-term partner by her side. By the time she turned 60, Lily Shu was still in great shape. Friends organized a small celebration for her. It wasn't particularly extravagant, just close friends, music, conversation, and a ballet performance she gave herself to those around her. There was nothing unusual about that night. No one could see any danger in her smile. No one could imagine that her life had only a few weeks left, and Nelson was still standing beside her. They still looked like the couple they had been for over a decade. But when police later investigated the relationship, they began to notice a problem they couldn't ignore. Long-term companionship doesn't mean there are no interests at stake. Quite the opposite. The longer two people are together, the more one knows about the other's habits, daily routines, financial structure, insurance details, properties, accounts, and which assets would change after death. What made Nelson particularly unique was this. He wasn't a financial amateur. He had worked in finance. He had long been involved in investment businesses. So when police began looking into how much wealth Lily Shu actually had, the decade-plus relationship took on a different meaning. Nelson may have known her assets better than anyone outside, and he may have understood better than most if Lily Shu died suddenly, which assets would be frozen, which interests would be redistributed, which arrangements could be modified, and who would stand to gain. Police then began accessing Lily Shu's property information. The deeper they dug, the more they realized this wasn't ordinary family wealth. According to the case file, the total value of Lily Shu's assets and related arrangements was estimated at $12 million to $14 million. At that point, a motive large enough to explain a murder for hire finally appeared. Enormous financial gain. What is more, police soon discovered that before Lily Shu's death, there had been attempts to change things regarding these assets. That meant the 3 gunshots on the street might not have been the beginning of the whole plan. The real story may have been unfolding in Lily Shu's financial accounts long before she died. When police began investigating Lily Shu's finances, the motive in the case suddenly became clearer, because they found that Lily Shu didn't just own a few houses or a modest savings account. According to the original case information, her total assets and related arrangements were estimated to be worth between $12 million and $14 million. That included real estate, financial accounts, insurance, trusts, and other wealth accumulated over the years. That was enough money to change anyone's life, and enough to make police rethink one question. After Lily Shu's death, who stood to benefit? That question quickly brought the investigation back to Nelson. Nelson had a background in finance. That meant he wasn't just a partner who knew Lily Hsu was wealthy. He likely understood asset allocation better than most. He knew how insurance beneficiaries worked. He understood what trusts meant. He knew how certain assets would be redistributed after the holder's death. They had lived together for over a decade. That kind of relationship meant Nelson had access to Lily Hsu's personal financial details. He knew what she had, which assets were most valuable, which accounts and insurance arrangements mattered most, and possibly which parts could be adjusted. Investigators later discovered that before Lily Hsu's murder, there had been some concerning moves involving her assets. According to the original account, about a month before the murder, Nelson had attempted to push for changes in some asset or benefit arrangements. Some of those changes were believed to involve shifting interests toward Nelson himself and his son. But that attempt did not succeed. Lily Hsu's insurance agent rejected the requested changes. The agent said the operation couldn't be carried out the way Nelson had proposed. For police, the timing was critical. Because it occurred before Lily Hsu was shot, if it was just routine financial advice, it wouldn't mean anything criminal. But if someone first tries to alter their partner's asset arrangements, and then the partner is suddenly and precisely targeted, those two events can't be viewed separately. Investigators began to suspect that Lily Hsu's wealth was the core interest behind the whole case. Especially when combined with the information from Hashem's phone, the logic became more complete. Hashem had no obvious reason to kill Lily Hsu, but he might have accepted the job for money. Nelson, meanwhile, had a long Fei-term relationship with Lily Hsu and was familiar with her finances. One person provided the target's information, another carried out the attack. The one who ultimately stood to gain wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. That was why police began to suspect murder for Fei hire. Moreover, Lily Hsu was 60. Her career was stable. Her assets were mature. Her life had entered a relatively settled phase. That meant if Nelson wanted to gain more from her wealth, simply waiting might not achieve his goal, especially since they weren't formally married. Long Fei-term partner status doesn't automatically grant inheritance rights. That made the asset arrangements themselves all the more critical, so police began investigating. Had Lily Hsu sensed Nelson's interest in her finances? Had there been conflicts between them over money? Had their feelings already changed? As the investigation deepened, new information emerged. According to Lily Hsu's friends, she may have been considering ending the relationship before her death. If that was accurate, then the motive might not just be wanting more money. It might also include a more urgent issue. If Lily Hsu was really about to break up, Nelson would soon lose access to her life. Once they separated, he would no longer have the same insight into her daily schedule. He wouldn't be able to continue intervening in her finances as a long Fei-term partner, and some of the asset adjustments he had tried to push might lose any chance of happening. For someone who may have placed great value on financial gain, that kind of change meant time was running out. Police thus suspected that Lily Hsu's possible intention to end the relationship might have been one of the triggers that accelerated the entire plot. Of course, since Nelson never stood trial, many details could never be fully verified in court, so his true mental state could never be known with 100% certainty. But what police saw was an increasingly complete chain of interests. Lily Hsu had enormous wealth. Nelson was financially sophisticated. Before the murder, there had been attempts to shift benefit arrangements. Their relationship may have been deteriorating. At the same time, a man Nelson already knew became involved in a plot to attack Lily Hsu. If all those threads were placed on the same timeline, the motive no longer seemed vague. That also explained why Oakland police later used a very blunt phrase to sum up the case at a press conference. They emphasized, this was not about race, it was about greed. That statement completely overturned the initial public perception. Lily Hsu wasn't randomly selected because she happened to be on a dangerous street. Police suspected she was targeted because someone believed she was worth more dead than alive, and if that judgment was correct, then the next most important question was, how did Nelson turn his own financial interests into a street shooting that looked completely disconnected? The answer lay in the division of labor in the entire plan. Who provided the time, who chose the location, who fired the shots, and who, after the gunfire ended, stayed at the scene to play the most innocent role. As police gradually placed Nelson and Hashim on the same investigative line, the street shooting that had initially seemed chaotic began to reveal signs of planning. If investigators' later evidence was correct, the most critical part of the case wasn't the complexity of the gunman's methods. On the contrary, what made it truly dangerous was how simple the plan was, and how well it fit the social environment of Oakland at the time. As long as it looked like an ordinary robbery, most people wouldn't look any deeper, and that, presumably, was exactly what the planner wanted. Step 1. Control Lily Shu's schedule. On the day of the murder, her trip to the massage parlor wasn't spontaneous. The appointment had been made in advance. Nelson knew the time. He knew the place. He knew Lily Shu would be with him. If the gunman needed to lie in wait, that information was indispensable. Then came communicating those details to the executor. Hashim drove the white car to the area from the surveillance footage. He didn't rush straight to the scene. Instead, he lingered nearby, waiting, watching. That suggested he was confirming a target he already knew would appear, rather than hunting for a random victim. Once Lily Shu's and Nelson's car arrived, the real action began. The gunman got out, moved quickly, didn't waste time choosing someone else, didn't treat Nelson as a threat. He locked onto Lily Shu immediately. That step was extremely important, because if the whole attack was meant to look like a robbery, the gunman had to make the scene look chaotic enough, while avoiding any harm to the wrong person. Nelson needed to live. He wasn't just Lily Shu's companion, he was also the most natural first witness after the shooting, a man who watched his partner be attacked and miraculously survived. He would easily gain the trust of police and the public, and that may have been the most ingenious part of the entire plan. After the shooting, Nelson could tell police everything happened too fast. The gunman came out of nowhere. The scene was total chaos. He didn't have time to react. That narrative fit perfectly with a random robbery. Add the fact that the crime scene was in a neighborhood with a long history of GN problems, and the case almost had a ready Fey-made explanation. Oakland street violence, Asian community GN decline, random shooting, maybe even anti-Fey Asian hate crime. No need to manufacture complicated evidence. No need for an overly elaborate crime scene. As long as the gunman came fast and left fast, the public would supply a seemingly reasonable explanation themselves. Step 2. Get Hashim out quickly. The entire attack lasted only seconds. He didn't stop to rummage for valuables. He didn't check if there was anything else worth taking. He didn't attack anyone else at the scene. His behavior was more like completing a defined objective. Shoot, retreat done. That meant robbery may never have been the goal, it was just the packaging. Step 3. Use Nelson's role to control the narrative afterward. According to the original investigation materials, the communications between Hashim and Nelson even included advice on how Nelson should respond if police asked him to identify suspects. If that arrangement actually existed, then the planner had thought beyond just killing Lily Shu. They had also considered the post-Fey crime investigation, because Nelson was an eyewitness. Police would naturally ask him, what did the gunman look like? Where did he come from? Which direction did he flee? Had he seen this person before? If the witness deliberately gave false information, it could waste critical hours in the early investigation. And in criminal cases, once the golden hours after the murder are lost, the real executor has more time to dispose of evidence, move vehicles, or even leave the area. From that perspective, Nelson wasn't just the person who provided the itinerary. He may have been designed as part of the plan itself, a living partner, a grieving witness, a person almost no one would suspect. Step 4. Hide the real motive behind social headlines. Lily Shu's death quickly triggered community outrage over anti-Phasian violence. Many residents directed their anger at GN. Media focused on Oakland's violent crime. The community demanded more police presence. The more intense that public debate became, the easier it was to overlook the private relationships. No one would immediately investigate whether a grieving boyfriend had financial motives. No one would naturally connect the stranger who fired the shots to the victim's partner, who had known him for years. As long as the white car wasn't accurately identified, as long as the fingerprints at the scene didn't match, as long as Hashim's phone wasn't obtained by police, that logic might have held random crime. Unknown gunman grieving boyfriend. They looked independent. but in fact, they may have all belonged to the same plan. The case truly began to unravel because the executor left too many traceable clues. The car had a source. The scene had fingerprints. The gun could be ballistically matched. The phone had communication records. Those pieces of evidence eventually allowed police to reconnect the seemingly separate people, Lily Shu, Nelson Hashim, and that prearranged massage appointment at that stage. Police believed the structure of the case was becoming increasingly clear. Nelson controlled the target's schedule. Hashim handled the field operation. Oakland's deteriorating Juan provided cover, and the massive wealth that would shift after Lily Shu's death formed the suspected core interest. But for Nelson, the real task wasn't just making Lily Shu die. After the shooting, he still had to make everyone believe that he was just a man who had lost his love. And what happened next showed that he had indeed begun doing exactly that. If police's later judgment was correct, the first problem Nelson faced after the shooting wasn't how to escape. It was how to stay in everyone's sight. He couldn't disappear, couldn't suddenly become cold, couldn't let anyone around him sense that he was prepared for Lily Shu's death. On the contrary, he had to appear more devastated than anyone else, because only then would the most dangerous position become the safest position. The victim's boyfriend, the survivor at the scene, the one who witnessed the shooting firsthand. On the surface, he had three identities that almost automatically earned trust. After the murder, Nelson began appearing frequently before the media and in front of friends and family. In interviews, he repeatedly described those few seconds: the gunfire, the screaming, the chaos, Lily Shu falling at emotional peaks. He would stop, cover his face, and be unable to continue speaking. People around him could only offer comfort. Journalists saw a man shattered by trauma. The public saw a survivor who had lost his loved one to street violence. No one would easily suspect such a person, especially since the entire community's anger was directed elsewhere at the time. People were discussing Juan, discussing gun violence, discussing whether Asians were being targeted in that media environment. Nelson didn't even need to fabricate many details. As long as he showed grief, the public would naturally fill in the rest of the explanation. Lily Shu was unlucky. She ran into a stranger with a gun. Nelson was lucky to survive. That was the version most readily accepted at the time. The day after Lily Shu's murder, the community held a vigil. Residents gathered near the scene. Candles were lit one by one. Flowers were placed along the street. People mourned the dentist who had practiced there for years and voiced anger at violent crime. Nelson had originally agreed to attend. According to the original account, he even planned to speak, urging police to catch the killer quickly. But in the end, he didn't show up in person. He sent someone else in his place. At the time, that didn't raise much suspicion. After all, no one could demand that a bereaved person grieve in a prescribed way. Some people could face a crowd, others might not be able to bear it. But looking back now, that was just one of many details in Nelson's post-Fay murder behavior. What truly solidified his public image was the funeral and memorial events that followed. On September Yi, Nansenin Arshar, Lily Shu's memorial service was held. Many friends, family, and community members attended. The church was nearly full. Nelson was there. He stood before everyone and spoke. He talked about their relationship. He expressed his longing at an emotional moment. He even sang for Lily Shu to most of those present. There was nothing suspicious about that scene. A man was saying goodbye to his partner in his own way. But as the investigation continued, some who knew Lily Shu began to have mixed feelings. Because Nelson's grief seemed to appear mostly where the public could see it, in front of cameras, at memorial services, at commemorative events. But when it came to matters that actually advanced the investigation, his enthusiasm didn't seem as strong. For example, after Lily Shu was shot and taken to the hospital, he didn't immediately follow the ambulance, or, in the search for the gunman, he didn't offer a substantial reward. None of those things alone proved criminal involvement, but they made police start wondering, was Nelson truly grieving, or was he managing an image of grief? One later event made that contrast even starker. Just days before his arrest, Nelson organized a memorial concert for Lily Shu. The promotional materials used Lily Shu's photos. Tickets were sold to the public. Prices ranged from a few $dozen to several hundred. Nelson appeared on stage in formal attire and performed. On the surface, that could still be explained as a tribute, using music to remember his partner, inviting friends to share memories. But when police soon announced he was suspected of involvement, that concert took on an entirely different meaning. Because if the charges were true, then the man on stage wasn't mourning a tragedy he couldn't prevent. He may have known exactly why Lily Hsu died, and even how the shooting had been carried out. That meant, in the 2 months after Lily Hsu's death, Nelson may have lived a double life. In private, he was the suspected planner. In public, he was the grieving family member. He could cry, receive comfort, demand that society address violent crime, even keep public attention focused on robbery and anti-Asian hate. As long as Hashem wasn't found, that role could continue. And that identity had another natural advantage. Nelson was an eyewitness. His statements carried weight in the early investigation. If police asked for a description of the gunman, he could answer. If they needed a suspect identification, he might participate, according to information police later obtained from communication records. They even suspected that Nelson and Hashem had discussed how to mislead the investigation during the identification process. If that was true, then the grieving boyfriend identity wasn't just a disguise. It was part of the plan itself. A real killer has to evade police, but a victim's family member doesn't. He can even stand in front of cameras, because the more people saw his tears, the fewer would ask, why didn't the gunman kill him? Why did he book the massage appointment? Why did the suspected shooter happen to be an old acquaintance? What ultimately ended that performance wasn't a slip-up during an interview, nor was it a friend seeing through him. It was evidence. The white car was found. Hashim was identified. The gun underwent ballistic comparison. The communications between the two men were obtained by police. When all those threads were connected, no amount of tears could change the direction of the case. On October 27, 2022, Hashem was arrested. That same day, police also arrested Nelson. The man who had spent the previous 2 months appearing as the grieving boyfriend in public was finally moved from the victim's family list to the suspect list. But no one expected that the time remaining for police to investigate him would be less than 1 day. The following afternoon, something happened in the jail. It ensured that one of the most important people in this case would never have his day in court. And it also meant that the central question of Lily Hsu's case, how Nelson would have explained all of this, would never receive a full answer. October 27, 2022, police arrested both Hashem and Nelson. One suspected of being the shooter at the scene, the other believed by police to have been involved in the murder plot. For Lily Hsu's family and friends, that day should have marked the beginning of the real judicial process. Now police could continue interrogations. Prosecutors could organize evidence, and Nelson would have to face a question he had never truly answered in public. Why did a woman you lived with for more than a decade die at the hands of a gunman you knew? But that question never got its day in court. The day after his arrest, on the afternoon of October 27, Nelson was being held at Santa Rita Jail. At about Sawudandenimbafin, during a routine check, jail officers found him in an abnormal state. They opened the cell. According to the original account, a T-Face shirt was found tied to the door handle and wrapped around Nelson's neck. Jail medical staff immediately began life-saving measures, but they couldn't save him. At approximately Sawudandenimbafin, Nelson was pronounced dead. Police then investigated the scene. They found no obvious signs of homicide, nor any evidence that a third party was involved. Ultimately, the death was ruled a suicide, and that meant one of the case's core defendants had left the world before any formal trial could begin. Nelson's death created a massive void in the case, because although police had gathered a great deal of evidence, they lost one of the most direct interrogation subjects. He could no longer explain his communications with Hashem. He couldn't explain why the gunman knew Lily Hsu's schedule. He couldn't answer whether the massage booking was just a normal routine or a way to give the gunman the exact time. He couldn't face prosecutors' questions about the finances. Most importantly, he would never stand in a courtroom and be cross-examined. So many questions in this case could only be pieced together through evidence and police findings. Rather than verified through a full trial after Nelson's death, police held a press conference outside the jail. This time, the police were very clear about the nature of the case. They emphasized, "This is not a case about race. This is a case about greed." That statement was important because it directly overturned a public narrative of the previous 2 months. After Lily Shu's death, many believed she was just another victim of Oakland's year-end decline. Some thought it was random robbery, others feared it was anti-Asian hate violence. The community held rallies, residents demanded more patrols, the media devoted extensive coverage to local violent crime and Asian safety issues. But the police now conveyed a completely different judgment. Lily Shu wasn't killed because she happened to be on the wrong street, nor because she randomly encountered a stranger with a gun. Police believed she may have been a designated target from the start, and behind that target wasn't racial hatred, but personal financial interest. Nelson's death also stirred complicated emotions in the public. Some believed he chose to evade legal responsibility as evidence mounted against him. Others argued that only a full trial could determine his specific role. After all, suspicion and indictment don't equal conviction, but the reality was, Nelson could no longer face a jury, and police could no longer get more explanations from him. So one question would forever lack its most direct answer. If Nelson really participated in planning this murder, when did he first conceive of it? Was it because the asset arrangement had been blocked, because their relationship was on the verge of ending, or were all these factors combined? No one could ever get confirmation from him again. However, after Nelson's death, other previously overlooked information began to surface. The most attention Faye-grabbing came from his biological son. The son had long been estranged from his father. In fact, he didn't even learn about Nelson's death from family. He found out through an old classmate faced with his father's death. His reaction was nothing like what the public might have expected. No intense grief, no shock. In his view, his father's personality and past behavior had long since destroyed their relationship. He then recounted some childhood experiences. Those memories gave the public a first glimpse of a Nelson completely different from the one seen on camera. A man who may have had a strong controlling streak, lack of empathy, and even a tendency toward violence within the family. Of course, those personal recollections couldn't directly prove guilt in Lily Shu's case, but they made people start to reconsider. Maybe the refined, wealthy, affectionate image Nelson projected on camera was never the whole story, and those who truly knew him may have seen the other version long ago. As that information became public, the grieving boyfriend image in Lily Shu's case completely collapsed. The suspect in police's eyes, the father in his son's memory, the partner on camera, 3 different Nelsons began to overlap. But the person who should have been the one to explain those contradictions had died in jail, so the remaining focus of the case fell on the only other living person, Hashim, the man police believed may have actually pulled the trigger. Nelson could leave the courtroom forever through death, but Hashim could not. He still had to face the charges, and face the prosecutor's next questions. Was he a lone gunman who acted on his own, or the executor of a murder Faye-for-Faye-hire plot? After Nelson's death, the public began to see the man in a new light. For the previous 2 months, most people had only seen one side of him on camera: refined, wealthy, musical. A tennis lover, a companion to Lily Shu for more than a decade. After her death, he repeatedly expressed grief in public. On the outside, he looked like a man who had suddenly lost his partner. But after Nelson's death, someone who had actually lived with him for years told a very different story. That person was his son, Byron. Byron had long been estranged from his father. How estranged? Even the news of Nelson's death in jail didn't come from family. He learned it from a high school friend. When asked how he felt, Byron didn't show the traditional signs of grief. He admitted he felt no strong sorrow at his father's death, because, in his view, the father-son relationship had been destroyed years ago. He then described his childhood, and those memories gave the public a first look at the Nelson who lived away from the cameras. Byron mentioned that when he was a child, his father exhibited strong controlling tendencies. One time, when he was in 6th grade, he wanted to call a girl he was dating. Nelson wouldn't allow it during the argument. His father even threw a phone at him. According to Byron, that attack left his nose bleeding. It wasn't an ordinary family argument. For young Byron, his father's anger could quickly escalate into violence. And that kind of fear wasn't limited to the father-son relationship. Byron also said that Nelson had been unfaithful to his mother for years. In his childhood memories, his father often had other women around. Nelson didn't seem to hide those relationships. The children witnessed him with different women many times. That gradually created an impression for Byron. His father cared a lot about what he wanted, but rarely considered the consequences of his actions on others. What disturbed Byron even more was Nelson's reaction to suffering. According to him, when Nelson saw people, or even animals, in pain in movies or real life, he sometimes showed an unsettling excitement. Byron, therefore, suspected his father lacked normal empathy. He even suggested he might have antisocial personality traits. Of course, a family member's personal assessment isn't a professional diagnosis, and having a problematic personality doesn't automatically mean someone committed a murder. But when those memories were placed alongside the police investigation, the public saw a stark contrast. Outwardly, Nelson could be very charming. He understood finance, he knew investing, he could sing, he could play tennis, he lived well, and he knew how to craft his image in social settings. But in the memories of his closest family, he could be a different person, controlling, aggressive when emotional, unfaithful in intimate relationships, and rarely empathetic to others' suffering. That contrast was also the most unsettling part of Lily Shu's case, because when Lily Shu met Nelson, she saw the same man with great qualities. A former financial company owner, a stable, well-spoken person, someone who could accompany her to music, tennis, and social events. For someone who had been through a marriage and years of building a career alone, that kind of partner seemed mature and reliable. Their more than decade together also made outsiders believe they had developed a deep bond. But if the father Byron described was closer to the real Nelson, then a question became worth considering. How much of him did Lily Shu truly know during all those years? Did she see all of Nelson, or only the side he chose to show? After the murder, that kind of image management seemed to reappear. Nelson knew how to face the public. When interviewed, he knew he should show grief. At the memorial, he could sing. At commemorative events, he could project the image of a loving partner. Even days before his arrest, he could still stand on stage at a concert honoring Lily Shu to outsiders. He seemed almost always in control of how he appeared. But police investigators saw the exact opposite. They saw a man who had long known the gunman, a man familiar with the victim's schedule, a man who understood financial structures, and a man who faced enormous potential financial gain after Lily Shu's death. The public began re-evaluating every one of Nelson's earlier public appearances. Were those tears genuine grief or fear? Were those memorial events born of love? Or were they just a way to keep playing the victim? No one could ever ask Nelson directly, but his death didn't stop the case, because one other person was still alive. Hashim Paulus believed he was directly connected to the white car, the physical evidence at the scene, and the weapon used, and unlike Nelson, Hashim would still have to face the judicial process. For prosecutors, the core question was clear. Even if the suspected mastermind was dead, could the man who actually came to the scene, approached Lily Shu, and allegedly pulled the trigger still be convicted of murder? And that brought the case into its final phase. Nelson would never stand trial, but Hashim's story wasn't over. After Nelson's death, the case entered an extremely unusual situation. Of the two men police suspected, one was dead. The other was still alive, and the only one who would continue facing criminal charges was Hashim. According to the original case information, prosecutors later filed multiple charges against Hashim, including murder. But he did not plead guilty. That meant Nelson's death wouldn't automatically end the case. Prosecutors still had to prove a core fact. Was Hashim the one who actually carried out the shooting? And did he carry out a targeted killing of Lily Shu according to a pre-arranged plan? For prosecutors, they didn't have just one thread of evidence. First, there was the white car. Surveillance footage from the scene linked the vehicle to the shooting. Paulus then traced the vehicle source, leading them to Hashim second. There was physical evidence left at the scene. According to the original case information, police compared fingerprints from the scene to databases and found a match with Hashim's past records. Traces found near Lily Shu's car also linked him to the scene. Then, there was the weapon. Paulus found multiple guns during a search of Hashim's residence. One of them, after ballistic testing, was determined to be connected to Lily Shu's shooting. If that evidence was ultimately admitted in court, it would form a very direct chain of physical evidence. The car brought Hashim to the scene. Fingerprints proved he had touched relevant areas or objects. The weapon further connected him to the actual shooting. Beyond that, there was the phone. This may have been the most sensitive piece of evidence in the entire case, because the phone wasn't just about who fired, it was also about why. If the communication records could prove Hashim and Nelson discussed timing, location, and operational details before the murder, then the case would shift from an individual crime to a pre-Fadeland murder with a division of labor. That was also the biggest challenge prosecutors faced. Because the person suspected of being the mastermind, Nelson, was dead, he couldn't testify, couldn't be cross-examined, couldn't explain the chat content. That meant if prosecutors wanted to build a complete murder for hire narrative, they would have to rely more heavily on objective evidence. The communication records themselves, the timing of contacts, the movements before and after the murder, vehicle locations, financial transactions, and whether Hashim had received any compensation. Those elements would determine whether police theories could be turned into facts acceptable to a court. For Hashim, there was also a key distinction. Even if Nelson's motives couldn't be fully proven, that didn't mean the person who pulled the trigger could escape responsibility. As long as prosecutors could prove Hashim came to the scene with intent, targeted Lily Shu, and carried out a fatal attack, he himself could still be held criminally liable for the most serious offense. In other words, Nelson's death may have left some details of the master plan permanently unanswered, but it didn't change the fact that the shooting happened. Lily Shu was indeed attacked on the street. The gunman was indeed there early. The attack was indeed highly targeted, and police had indeed connected Hashim to the center of the case through the vehicle, fingerprints, weapons, and communication records. What remained unresolved was how a court would ultimately interpret that evidence. Would Hashim insist he had nothing to do with the case? Would he deny any criminal plan with Nelson? Or would the trial produce new witnesses, new communications, or even new financial evidence? According to the timeline in the original material, Hashim still denied the charges, and the case had not yet reached a final judicial conclusion. So what this case truly leaves behind is not a fully closed ending. It is an extremely rare state. The alleged mastermind is dead. The alleged executor still awaits judicial proceedings, but the victim's family must continue to endure a long legal process. But why she died, who was involved, and what role each person played, all of that still needs to be answered piece by piece. This case was originally packaged as a random street shooting. Then it became a suspected murder for hire. Then one of the key suspects died in jail. What is left is a story that still needs a court to finish, and no matter how the judicial process finally unfolds, one thing is already hard to change. On the day Lily Shu was murdered, she wasn't randomly chosen by a stranger with a gun. From the evidence police gathered, she appears to have been a pre-selected target. The only real questions left are these: who decided she had to die? Who made the plan? Who carried it out? And who, after the gunfire stopped, was supposed to benefit from her death? Those questions are what make this case chilling to this day. Looking back at this case, the original story was actually very simple. A high-fi crime neighborhood, a white car that appeared out of nowhere, a stranger with a gun, a Chinese-American woman lying in the street. The scene didn't offer many explanations, so everyone instinctively understood it as just another case of out-of control, violent crime in Oakland. That judgment wasn't absurd, because before Lily Shu was killed, there had indeed been multiple robberies and shootings targeting businesses and Asian residents in the area. So when the gunshots rang out, the public almost immediately found a seemingly reasonable answer. Random robbery, deteriorating juren, even anti-Asian hate crime, but what really turned the case around wasn't some sudden eyewitness. It was a few small questions that never quite made sense. Why was the suspect vehicle parked there early? Why was the gunman willing to wait even with police cars passing by? Why, after getting out, didn't he target the closer person? Why was there almost no actual theft during the attack? And most critically, how could a stranger know exactly when Lily Shu would appear there? When those questions were laid out one by one, the seemingly random shooting began to take on a different shape. This may not have been a stranger randomly choosing a victim at all. It may have been someone who knew the target in advance, knew her schedule, knew she would show up on time, even knew who absolutely could not be harmed at the scene. That white car eventually led police to Hashim. Fingerprints turned his name from a suspect into a focus of investigation. Ballistics narrowed the scope further, and the phone records gave police the first glimpse of a hidden connection between the gunman and Lily Shu's private life. That connection ultimately pointed to Nelson, a man who had been with Lily Shu for more than a decade, a man who knew her daily routine, a man who had worked in finance and likely knew her asset structure very well, and the most seemingly innocent survivor on the day of the murder. If the police's investigative theory was correct, the most dangerous part of this crime wasn't how brutal the gunman was. It was how the entire plan exploited what people are most willing to believe. People believe street crime happens randomly. They believe a boyfriend who survived a shooting is also a victim. They believe someone who breaks down crying on camera couldn't possibly be connected to a murder. They believe that a person who has been by their side for more than a decade wouldn't be the one who most wanted them to disappear. But that is the cruelest part of criminal cases. Appearance and reality can be two completely different things. Police later summed up the suspected motive in one word: greed. That made Lily Shu's years of accumulated wealth take on a tragic irony. She spent decades building her life. From China to America, Rifei obtaining professional credentials, running a clinic, building a reputation, ultimately creating her own career and assets. Those things originally represented her success, but if police were right, they may have ultimately become the reason someone wanted her dead. Nelson's death also left a void that can never be filled. He never made it to court, never faced a full trial, never answered the questions that police and the victim's family most wanted to ask. So regarding his ultimate legal responsibility, many things can no longer be determined through a formal verdict. The only person still facing the judicial process is the suspected shooter, Hashim. That is why it is important to maintain a key distinction in this case: the police's investigative judgment, the prosecutor's charges, and the facts eventually confirmed by the court. These are not the same thing until the judicial process is fully concluded. Some questions still await the court's answers, but regardless of the final verdict, one thing already sets this case apart from its original narrative. Lily Shu's death is no longer easily understood as a random act of street violence. The evidence points to a far more targeted operation, and all of it was initially hidden in just 5 seconds. 3 gunshots, a woman falls, a man survives. A white car drives away. If the surveillance footage hadn't been reviewed carefully, if the vehicle hadn't been traced, if the fingerprints at the scene hadn't matched the database, if police hadn't opened Hashim's phone, perhaps the public would have always believed another version. Lily Shu was just unlucky. In a dangerous city, she ran into a stranger with a gun, and the man who wept for her afterward would have remained in everyone's memory as the grieving partner. That is what makes this case so chilling. Sometimes the person who truly needs to be investigated isn't the stranger who emerges from the darkness. It is the one who, before the shots were fired, knew the victim would be there, who stood to gain from her death, and who, after everything was over, worked hardest to tell everyone this was just an accident.